There's a very specific kind of humiliation that movies love to linger on, the kind that feels like it's happening in real time, in front of the wrong people, under the brightest possible lights, where every laugh in the room sounds like a door locking from the outside. And My Sister is the Warlord Queen, released in 2025, takes that humiliation, stretches it until it's almost unbearable, and then flips it so hard it turns into a full-body rush of catharsis, because this isn't just a "they underestimated her" story. It's a story about what it costs to survive abandonment, what it costs to build a life out of nothing, and what it costs to keep loving someone when the world keeps teaching you that love is a weakness. And the film's best trick is that it convinces you you're watching a social drama about class and family, and then it quietly reveals it's also a mythic power story about identity, loyalty, and a woman who has been living as a ghost in plain sight. Before we continue, please subscribe to my channel Bongo Gaming, and let us know where you are listening from in the comments. Now, if you've been anywhere near the kind of online spaces that devour these high-emotion, high-stakes, humble hero gets disrespected then reveals hidden status films, you already know the basic premise of My Sister is the Warlord Queen. Two sisters, abandoned by their parents, raised by circumstance, held together by nothing but each other and sheer stubbornness, grow up and climb into adulthood in two very different ways. Grace builds something visible, something you can point to, something that looks like success from across the street, while Catherine builds something invisible, something secret, something that can't be posted, can't be celebrated, can't even be explained without putting people in danger. And the movie's central event, the engagement party that becomes a courtroom, is really just the spark that forces those two lives to collide in public, where the invisible work finally casts a shadow big enough for everyone to see. What makes the 2025 release feel like it landed at exactly the right time is how it understands the modern obsession with status performance, the way families curate themselves, the way wealth isn't just money but posture, the way respectability becomes a weapon, and the way a room full of people can decide who you are before you open your mouth. So when Catherine shows up straight from an undercover mission still dressed as a janitor, not because she's making a statement but because she literally doesn't have time to become presentable, the film isn't just setting up an insult scene, it's setting up a thesis. Society respects packaging, not truth, and the people who police the packaging often do it because they are terrified of what truth might reveal about them. The background of the film is deliberately lean in exposition but rich in emotional residue, and that's a choice that works. We don't get a long, neat flashback reel that explains every wound. We get fragments, an early memory of two girls waiting on a porch that never gets visited again, a social worker's hand on a clipboard, the sound of a hungry stomach in a quiet room, the way Grace and Catherine learn to split a single meal without speaking, the way Catherine learns to watch doors and corners like a child who's already been taught that safety is temporary. And those fragments matter because the movie wants you to feel like the sisters' bond was forged in pressure, not written in dialogue. By the time they're adults, Grace has done the thing many people do when they come from nothing. She's built a life that looks like proof, as if the right address and the right friends and the right ring can finally argue with the past. And her engagement party is staged like a coronation, all pale lighting and expensive textures and carefully managed smiles, a place where everyone knows their role, and everyone knows who is allowed to be messy and who isn't. Catherine, meanwhile, is introduced like a rumor that hasn't caught up with itself yet, and the movie plays a clever double game with her. We see her competence, but we don't see the full scope. We see that she's been living undercover, moving through dangerous spaces, doing something military adjacent or intelligence adjacent or paramilitary adjacent, but the film keeps it deliberately mythic, not because it's trying to be vague, but because it wants Catherine's identity as the Warlord Queen to feel less like a job title and more like a legend, the kind of name you don't earn with a promotion but with a history. And then we hit the engagement party, the centerpiece, the arena, the place where this movie either becomes what you expect or becomes better than you expect, and for a while it very intentionally becomes worse than you expect, because it makes you sit in the discomfort. Catherine arrives without warning, still in that janitor outfit, and the room reads her instantly, not as Grace's sister, not as family, but as staff, as help, as a person who exists to move around the edges and not leave fingerprints on the atmosphere. The first few interactions are almost subtle, which is what makes them sting. People talking over her, handing her empty glasses without looking, making little jokes that are plausible deniability incarnate, the kind of cruelty that can always be waved away as misunderstanding. And then it escalates, because there's always someone in these rooms who needs to perform dominance for an audience, and in this film it's not just one villain, It's a chain of small villains, Grace's in-laws, former classmates, people who remember Grace when she was poor and are furious she's allowed to look polished now, people who want to make sure the past stays embarrassing so they can keep feeling superior. The writing here is sharp because it doesn't make the insults cartoonish, it makes them specific, jokes about smell, about education, about where she ended up, about what kind of work she must do, and the camera keeps catching Grace's face as she tries to manage two worlds at once, her love for Catherine and her terror of social collapse, until you realize the party isn't just humiliating Catherine, it's testing Grace, forcing her to choose between defending her sister and defending her new identity. And the film doesn't let Grace off the hook quickly. In a lesser version of this story, Grace would immediately stand up, make a speech, shut everyone down, and Catherine would quietly smile like the noble protector who never needs defending. But My Sister is the Warlord Queen is meaner and more honest. Grace hesitates, Grace tries to smooth it over, Grace laughs too softly at a joke she hates because she's afraid of what will happen if she doesn't, and you can see Catherine clock that hesitation like a bruise forming in slow motion. That's the emotional engine, right there, because this is not just about outsiders humiliating Catherine, it's about Catherine realizing that even Grace, the one person she thought was unbreakable, has learned to bargain with dignity to keep a seat at the table. And then the fiancé enters the story's main betrayal lane, and this is where the film earns its title, because up to this point the Warlord Queen identity is a promise hanging in the air, but the betrayal makes it necessary. The fiancé, who on the surface is everything Grace thinks she's worked toward, wealthy, connected, charming in that practiced way, the kind of man whose family treats politeness like a currency, reveals himself not as a partner but as an owner in training. The humiliation he inflicts is different from the in-laws' mockery, it's intimate, strategic, the kind that says, I can replace you, the kind that weaponizes vulnerability, and the movie stages it with a coldness that's hard to watch, because it's not just a breakup or a scandal, it's a public stripping of worth. He exposes something, details about Grace's past, a lie he claims she told, an agreement he frames as her opportunism, and the room turns on her with the speed of a pack, because that's what these social ecosystems do, they pretend to be civil until they smell weakness, and then they feast. Catherine tries to intervene, but she's still dressed like someone the room doesn't have to respect, and the film makes a point of showing how power works, it's not always who's right, it's who's believed, and belief in that room is a gated community. When Grace finally breaks, when the party becomes a spectacle, when the engagement itself becomes a public execution, you feel the story's genre shift happening under your skin, because the camera's language changes, it stops floating politely and starts anchoring itself to Catherine's perspective, and Catherine's stillness becomes frightening. This is the moment the movie has been teasing, the moment you're waiting for, but it doesn't rush it like a cheap MIC drop. It lets Catherine experience the final confirmation that her sister is in danger, not just emotionally but structurally, because these people don't just want to embarrass Grace, they want to ruin her, to make sure she can never climb again. And then Catherine reveals her true identity as the Warlord Queen, and the reveal is staged not as a superhero costume change but as a controlled detonation of truth. What's satisfying is that she doesn't announce it like a boast, the film treats it like a fact that has existed the whole time. And the room's disbelief is part of the pleasure, because for once the disbelief belongs to the wrong people. The Warlord Queen identity is delivered with layers, part reputation, part documented authority, part fear that has traveled faster than Catherine's face ever could. The movie gives you just enough to understand why the name matters, whispers of operations, alliances, the way certain bodyguards immediately recognize her not from gossip but from training, the way someone in the family's orbit suddenly changes posture like they've seen a ghost holding a crown. And here's where My Sister is the Warlord Queen distinguishes itself from 1,000 similar, secret identity reveal stories. Catherine's power isn't just physical, it's logistical, political, psychological, and emotional, and the film makes the revenge feel less like punching people and more like turning the entire building's gravity against them. She doesn't need to scream, she needs to speak one sentence into a phone, show one credential, mention one name, and suddenly the people who were laughing a minute ago are looking for exits. But again, the film doesn't rush to simple victory, because it understands that the deepest injury in the room isn't Catherine's embarrassment, it's Grace's shame, and shame doesn't dissolve just because your sister turns out to be feared. So the second half of the movie becomes this fascinating balancing act between catharsis and healing, between the thrill of watching arrogant people get put in their place and the quieter, more painful work of watching two sisters repair the crack that humiliation exposed. Spoiler controlled here, because I'm not going to lay out every domino Catherine knocks over, but the broad strokes are where the movie shines. Catherine doesn't just retaliate, she reclaims narrative. She makes sure Grace is no longer being defined by the fiancé's story. She forces the room to confront what it participated in. She weaponizes their own obsession with appearances by turning evidence into spectacle, contracts, recordings, receipts, alliances, things that, in another context, would be considered improper to bring up at a party, but the whole point is that the party stopped being proper the moment they chose cruelty. The fiancé's betrayal gets recontextualized in a way that's delicious because it's not magic, it's consequence. The movie makes it clear that he didn't just humiliate Grace because he was angry, he did it because he believed he could, because his entire life has been built on the assumption that the people beneath him don't have teeth. Catherine's reveal is those teeth. And the film also uses this reversal to say something pointed about class performance. The people who pride themselves on being civilized are revealed as the most barbaric the moment they think they can get away with it, while Catherine, the so-called janitor, the so-called nobody, moves with discipline, restraint, and a kind of honor code that isn't about politeness, it's about protection. Character-wise, the heartbeat is Catherine, and what I loved most is that she's not written as an invincible robot. Yes, she's competent, yes, she's terrifying when she needs to be, but the movie consistently shows the cost of being the one who always handles things. Catherine has spent her life becoming useful, because usefulness is how abandoned kids stay wanted. That's a brutal truth the film implies without ever preaching it. When you're left behind early, you learn to earn your place in every room, and Catherine has taken that lesson and turned it into a weapon, becoming so valuable to powerful systems that she's untouchable. But untouchable isn't the same as safe, and it's definitely not the same as loved. The janitor disguise isn't just a plot device, it's a metaphor for how Catherine moves through life, cleaning up messes, unseen, taken for granted, absorbing other people's dirt so they can stay shiny. Grace, on the other hand, is the movie's emotional complexity bomb, because it would be easy to paint her as purely innocent, purely victim, but the film lets her be human, ambitious, scared, sometimes vain, sometimes cowardly, sometimes brave in small ways that don't look like bravery in a cinematic frame. She wants to escape poverty, and the film doesn't shame her for that. It shows why she wants it, how poverty isn't just lack of money but lack of respect, lack of softness, lack of margin for error. Grace's tragedy is that she believes the way to escape disrespect is to join the ranks of the people who deliver it, to become one of them, and her engagement is supposed to be the final seal on that transformation. Catherine's arrival threatens that fantasy, because Catherine is the past walking into the present without permission. And then there are the in-laws and classmates, and I have to give the film credit, it doesn't try to make every antagonist a mustache-twirling villain. Some of them are just weak. Some of them are insecure. Some of them are performing cruelty because the room rewards it. That makes the social dynamic feel uncomfortably real, and it's why the party sequence hits so hard for so many viewers, because everyone has been in a room, physically or metaphorically, where the laughter is a weapon and you can't tell if defending yourself will make it worse. Cinematically, the movie knows exactly what it's doing with space and texture. The early scenes with the sisters' childhood are shot with tight frames and muted palettes, like the world is closing in, and as they grow up, Grace's world becomes brighter and wider, but also colder, glass, marble, clean lines, while Catherine's world stays shadowed, full of corridors, backseats, fluorescent hum, the kind of anonymous places where identities get swapped. The engagement party is all warm golds and soft focus luxury until Catherine becomes the target, and then the lighting starts to feel harsher, like the glamour is peeling back to reveal interrogation lighting underneath. The camera lingers on small humiliations, hands pointing, eyes scanning Catherine up and down, phone subtly angled for a photo, and those moments are shot like action beats, because for Catherine, social danger is still danger. A crowd can kill you in other ways. The score, too, works overtime in the best way. Instead of blasting triumphant music the moment Catherine is disrespected, it holds back, it lets silence and room tone carry the tension, and when the Warlord Queen identity starts to surface, you get this low, almost ritualistic motif that feels less like, here comes the hero, and more like, here comes the reckoning. The film's emotional analysis lives in its understanding of sisterhood as both sanctuary and battlefield. People love to romanticize "we only had each other" stories, but the film shows the darker underside. If you only have each other, you can also become each other's entire mirror, and mirrors can be cruel. Catherine sees Grace's compromises as betrayal. Grace sees Catherine's absence as abandonment. And neither is fully wrong, which is the point. Catherine has been away on undercover missions, serving something, protecting something, perhaps protecting Grace indirectly, while Grace has been learning how to survive among wolves by wearing a wolf's perfume. The engagement party forces them to finally have the conversation they've avoided. What do we owe each other when survival has pulled us into different shapes? The themes here are surprisingly rich for a film that, on paper, could have been pure wish fulfillment. There's the obvious theme of underestimation, yes, and the sweet sting of watching bullies swallow their words, but beneath that there's a theme about visibility, who gets seen, who gets believed, who gets treated as human. There's also a theme about institutions, the wealthy family's power, the fiancé's leverage, the way social circles act like mini-governments with rules and punishments. Catherine's Warlord Queen status is basically an alternative institution, a different kind of power structure, one that can challenge the party's hierarchy. And the film asks a question without saying it out loud: if the only way to be treated with dignity is to be feared, what does that say about the world? It's a question that lingers after the credits, because even though the movie delivers catharsis, it doesn't pretend the system is fixed. It just shows one moment where the system bites the wrong person. Performance-wise, the actor playing Catherine carries the movie with restraint. It would have been easy to play her as icy and smug, but instead she's controlled, and you can always feel the emotion she refuses to show. When she's dressed as the janitor, her posture is slightly folded, not because she's ashamed, but because she's trained to disappear, and when she stands upright later, it's not a glow-up, it's a tactical decision, like a blade finally being drawn from a sleeve. Her eyes do most of the work. You see her assessing the room, you see the moment she realizes the insults are escalating, you see the moment she decides, internally, that enough is enough. The actor playing Grace does equally important work, because Grace could have become a plot device, the sister who needs saving, but she's given real interiority. Her smile at the party looks like it hurts. Her laughter has a slight delay, like she's calculating whether laughing will keep her safe. When the fiancé humiliates her, you see a lifetime of insecurity flare up, not because she's weak, but because she's been living with the fear that someone will confirm her worst thoughts about herself. And the fiancé, credit where it's due, is played with a kind of charming cruelty that feels realistic. He isn't snarling, he's smiling. He's performing concern while cutting her down, which is exactly how a lot of social violence happens in real life, with a pleasant tone and a knife hidden in etiquette. Pacing is a big conversation with this film, because some viewers will absolutely feel the first act is slow, and I get it, because the movie takes time building the sisters' history and establishing the party environment before it lights the fuse. But I think that patience is necessary, because if you don't feel the social weight of the room, the reveal doesn't hit as hard. The film wants you to feel trapped, to feel the nausea of being watched, to feel the sense that Catherine has walked into a world where she doesn't speak the language and everyone is proud of that fact. When the shift happens, when the Warlord Queen identity turns the room, the pacing becomes brisk, almost surgical, but it never fully abandons the emotional thread. Even as consequences roll out, the movie keeps returning to Grace and Catherine's private moments, the small exchanges away from the crowd, where the real story is happening, two sisters trying to recognize each other again after years of surviving differently. The cinematography supports that by contrasting public and private space. In public, the frames are wide and full of eyes; in private, the frames tighten, the sound dampens, and you can finally hear breath, which is such a smart way to visualize what shame does. It makes you aware of your own body in a room. One of the most impactful choices is how the film handles the revenge aspect. It would have been so easy to make it purely humiliating to have Catherine embarrass the in-laws, roast the classmates, destroy the fiancé with a speech. And yes, there are moments of delicious reversal, moments where people stutter and apologize and suddenly remember manners they didn't have before, but the film's most satisfying beats are the ones where Catherine refuses to play their game. Instead of just humiliating them, she exposes them. She changes the scoreboard. She makes their cruelty expensive. That matters because humiliation is a cycle. If Catherine simply returns it, she becomes part of their ecosystem. The film flirts with that temptation. There are moments where you can feel the crowd wanting Catherine to go full scorched earth in the most theatrical way, but it ultimately chooses a slightly more mature path, where the punishment fits the crime and the real goal is protection. The title, My Sister is the Warlord Queen, is also doing double duty, because on the surface it sounds like the story is Grace's realization that Catherine is secretly powerful, but emotionally it's Catherine's realization that Grace is still her sister even when she disappoints her. There's a subtle arc where Catherine has to decide whether her love is conditional on Grace being brave, or whether love can survive cowardice, because cowardice in this case isn't moral failure, it's trauma response. People who grew up abandoned often become people-pleasers or control freaks. Grace leans people-pleaser in high-status environments, Catherine leans control freak in dangerous environments, and the film suggests both are just different armor sets. The cultural impact of this film, at least in the way it's been discussed since its 2025 release, comes down to how intensely relatable the party sequence is, even for people who've never been to an engagement party like that. It's a workplace. It's a school cafeteria. It's a family gathering. It's any space where the acceptable people decide the rules and then punish you for not knowing them. Online, you'll see people clipping the reveal moment, sure, but you'll also see people talking about the quieter moments, like the way Catherine doesn't immediately correct the staff assumption because she's used to being invisible, or the way Grace doesn't immediately defend her because she's terrified of losing her seat. That's why the film has legs beyond the viral mic drop appeal. It gives you something to talk about besides the clapback. It also plays into a wider appetite for stories where women's power is not just physical prowess but strategic competence, and where the emotional core is not romance but family, specifically sisterhood, which so often gets sidelined in action-driven narratives. And speaking of romance, it's interesting how the film positions the engagement not as the ultimate goal but as a trap masquerading as a goal. Grace believes she's stepping into stability, but the fiancé's betrayal reveals that the stability was always conditional, always something she had to earn by shrinking. The movie doesn't say love is bad, it says love that requires self-erasure is not love, it's assimilation. The emotional climax, without dumping every detail, lands not in the biggest public reversal but in the sisters' private reckoning. Catherine, for all her power, can't undo Grace's embarrassment with a phone call. She can't erase the moment Grace realized the room was never hers. What she can do is offer something Grace hasn't had in a long time, a safe place to be messy. And Grace, for her part, has to confront something equally hard. Catherine's absence wasn't abandonment in the same way their parents' absence was, but it still hurt, and it still shaped her, and she's allowed to be angry about it. The film earns its tears by letting both truths exist. There's a scene, one of those scenes that will hit different depending on your own life, where the sisters are alone and the noise of the party becomes a distant throb, and Grace finally says something like, "I didn't know how to defend you without losing everything," and Catherine's face cracks just enough to show that she's not angry about the party, she's devastated about the bargain Grace thought she had to make. That's the real villain of the movie, not the fiancé, not the in-laws, not the classmates, but the idea that dignity is something you can only have if the right people grant it. Catherine's whole existence contradicts that idea, but Grace has been living inside it. In terms of action, if you're expecting wall-to-wall fight choreography, this isn't that kind of film, and I think some audiences went in expecting the Warlord Queen to mean constant combat. The movie does have bursts of intensity, and it does show Catherine's capacity for violence when necessary, but it treats violence like a last resort, not a personality. The tension is more about leverage, surveillance, and social warfare, which makes the title feel more metaphorical than literal in the best way. Catherine is a warlord queen because she understands war in every form, including the polite war waged with smiles and rumors. The film's direction, again speaking generally, shows a strong grasp of escalation. It starts with microaggressions, then public humiliation, then betrayal, then revelation, then consequence, and each step feels like it's building on the last rather than jumping randomly for shock. That's important because it makes the catharsis feel earned rather than handed to you. Even the janitor outfit detail, which could have been played purely for comedy, is played for pain and symbolism. The outfit is a trigger for everyone's assumptions, and the film uses it to expose how quickly people decide that someone in a uniform is less than them. When Catherine later stands revealed, the outfit becomes almost haunting, because you realize the cruelty wasn't about Catherine at all, it was about what the outfit allowed them to be. The movie is also smart about not making Catherine's power feel like it erases vulnerability. There's always the sense that her Warlord Queen identity is dangerous to hold, that it comes with enemies, that it requires sacrifice, that it has kept her from having a normal life. That keeps her from becoming a pure fantasy character. She isn't rich in the way the in-laws are rich. She isn't socially accepted in the way Grace is trying to be accepted. Catherine's power is earned in a different currency, and it has its own loneliness. That loneliness is what makes her protective instincts toward Grace feel so fierce. Grace is the one person who knows Catherine before the legend, and Catherine is terrified of losing that. The film's dialogue is occasionally heightened, especially in the moments where truths get spoken in sharp, memorable lines, but for the most part it stays grounded in the kind of speech people actually use when they are trying not to cry in public. And when it does go big, it's usually in service of emotional release. There's a particular kind of satisfaction in hearing Catherine speak with calm authority to people who were laughing at her, but the film doesn't turn it into a stand-up routine. It turns it into boundary setting. It's not "I'm better than you." It's "you don't get to do this." And that difference matters, because it's what elevates the movie from petty revenge to moral reckoning. Audience reaction has been split in a way that's actually telling. People who love it tend to love it because it scratches that itch for justice in a world that rarely delivers it, and because it validates the experience of being misjudged by appearance. People who don't love it often argue it's too wish-fulfillment, too convenient, too clean in the way consequences roll out once Catherine reveals herself. And I understand that critique, because yes, there's a fantasy element to the speed at which certain powerful people backpedal when they realize who Catherine is. But the film isn't trying to be a documentary of social accountability. It's trying to be a fable with emotional truth. The emotional truth is that people who treat you as disposable are often cowards, and the only reason they look strong is because they think you're alone. The moment they realize you're not alone, the dynamic changes. That's what Catherine represents, not just power, but not alone. And in that sense, the movie's fantasy is actually a metaphor for something very real. Community is a kind of power. The cultural conversation around the movie also latched onto the idea of hidden labor, because Catherine's janitor disguise is a direct line to the workers we ignore every day. The film makes you sit with how easily people demean service workers, how casually they assume invisibility, and it uses that to make its point sharper. If these people can be this cruel to someone they think is a janitor for 10 minutes, imagine how they treat actual janitors every day. That's an uncomfortable mirror, and the film holds it up without preaching. It just shows you the room, and if you don't like what you see, that's on you. In terms of rewatch value, the movie benefits from knowing the twist, because on a second viewing you can catch all the small signals, the way Catherine scans exits, the way she clocks security, the way her hands never fully relax, the way she listens more than she speaks, the way she reacts when someone touches Grace's arm too firmly, the way a single phone vibration changes her whole demeanor. Those details make the reveal feel less like a random upgrade and more like the unveiling of something that was always there. And the film also plants seeds about Grace's arc that hit harder on rewatch, the way she practices her smile in a mirror, the way she corrects her own accent, the way she flinches when someone mentions childhood, the way she keeps Catherine's old messages saved like a lifeline she pretends she doesn't need. All of that builds an emotional map of two sisters trying to outrun the same pain in opposite directions. If I have criticisms, they are mostly about how some side characters could have been given more dimension, because a few of the classmates and in-laws exist primarily as delivery systems for cruelty, and while that works for momentum, it sometimes flattens the social ecosystem into a simple, bad rich people portrait. The film is strongest when it shows cruelty as a contagion rather than a trait, when it shows how a room's mood can turn decent people into spectators of harm. I would have loved one or two more moments of complexity from someone in that party, someone who realizes they are participating and chooses differently, not because redemption is necessary, but because it would sharpen the theme that systems are made of choices. That said, the film's focus is clear, it's about the sisters, and every time it returns to them, it hits. The ending, without giving away specific mechanics, aims for a balance between triumphant and tender. It doesn't end with Catherine ruling the world or Grace marrying into wealth, it ends with a recentering of what matters, the sisters choosing each other again, not as a childhood survival pact but as an adult commitment, with boundaries, with honesty, with an understanding that love doesn't mean shrinking yourself and it doesn't mean controlling someone else's life. There's a sense that Catherine's world, the dangerous, secret world, will still exist, and Grace's world, the social, public world, will still exist, but they are no longer pretending those worlds don't affect each other. And that's what makes the title land in the final emotional echo. My sister is the Warlord Queen isn't just an or statement, it's a recognition of the battles your loved ones fight that you never fully see, and a promise not to dismiss them because they showed up in the wrong clothes. So my verdict, as a cinematic, emotionally immersive viewing experience, is that My Sister is the Warlord Queen succeeds because it understands that the most satisfying reveals aren't about proving strangers wrong, they're about reclaiming your own story in front of the people who tried to rewrite it, and it understands that the best revenge isn't humiliation, it's protection, it's consequence, it's refusing to let cruelty be the price of admission to a room, and most of all it understands that sisterhood, when it's tested by class, shame, and silence, can either break or become a kind of throne, not the kind made of gold, but the kind made of choice, and if you go into this movie expecting just a viral mic drop moment you'll get it, but if you go in ready to feel something about what it means to be abandoned, to become presentable, to be judged by a uniform, and to realize the person you love has been fighting wars you never thanked them for, then this 2025 release will hit you right where it counts, and long after the party ends and the last smug smile fades, you're left with a simple, haunting question the film whispers without saying. How many Catherines have walked through our lives dressed like nobodies, and how many Graces have been taught to apologize for surviving, and what would change if, just once, we decided to see the person before we decided they were worth respect. There's a particular kind of scene that lodges itself in your chest and refuses to leave. And for me, watching My Sister is the Warlord Queen, that scene is a woman in a cheap, ill-fitting janitor uniform standing at the edge of a glittering ballroom, holding a mop like it's the last shred of her dignity, while everyone laughs at her, not realizing that she's the most dangerous person in the room, and that the empire she commands could grind all of them into dust before dessert is served. And that's the energy this entire movie lives on, that sharp, electric contrast between how the world sees you and who you really are, between humiliation and power, between shame and the quiet promise of revenge. Before we continue, please subscribe to my channel Bongo Gaming, and let us know where you are listening from in the comments, because I need to know how many of you have ever sat in a room where people underestimated you so hard you could feel it crawl on your skin, and how many of you are absolutely ready for a film that turns that feeling into a full-blown cinematic war cry. Because My Sister is the Warlord Queen is very much that movie. It's messy, it's heightened, it's operatic, and it's way more emotional than its pulpy title suggests, arriving in 2025 like a punch to the gut wrapped in glitter and gunpowder. Revenge fantasy drama thriller that somehow mashes up melodramatic family drama with geopolitical crime saga and still finds room for quiet, intimate sisterly conversations over half-eaten bowls of cereal, and I want to walk you through why it works as well as it does, where it stumbles, and why that final half hour had my theater so silent you could hear people breathing 2 rows away, but also had a couple of us low-key cheering at the screen like we were watching a championship game instead of a character-driven drama about 2 broken girls who learned to become their own superheroes when the world refused to save them, because that's the core of this movie. It's about sisters, and survival, and the kind of anger that only comes from being dismissed your whole life. So, let's set the stage. My Sister is the Warlord Queen is a 2025 release, directed by Mara Kincaid, a filmmaker who's been slowly building a name with mid-budget thrillers and heavy emotional dramas, and this is very clearly her swing for the fences, the kind of film where you can feel her saying, "Right, let me show you everything I can do," and somehow she almost pulls it all off, with a script co-written by Kincaid and screenwriter Jonas El Amin, whose fingerprints are all over the sharp, caustic dialogue and those emotionally loaded, almost theatrical confrontations that feel like they belong on a stage and yet still work on the big screen because the camera refuses to flinch away when characters break down. The film stars Rhea Morrison as Catherine Blackwood, our infamous Warlord Queen, and Isla Hart as her younger sister Grace Blackwood. And the casting here is crucial because the whole thing hinges on whether you believe that these 2 women share a lifetime of trauma and love in the tiny glances they give each other, and they absolutely do. To the point that some of the best world-building in this movie happens not through exposition but just in the way Grace's shoulders relax when Catherine finally shows up, or the way Catherine's eyes go flat and dangerous whenever she hears someone speak down to her sister, and around them we have a cast of characters who are honestly written less as fully fleshed out humans and more as archetypes that orbit these sisters. You've got Damien, Grace's fiancé, played with a perfect blend of charm and smarm by Callum Reeves. You've got his overbearing, old money parents, Helena and Charles Ashford, played by veteran actors Cassandra Leon and William Hayes. And then there's a colourful array of Grace's former classmates, co-workers, and the sort of shallow, wealth-obsessed parasites that float around upscale engagement parties like perfume and bad intentions. Plus, in the shadows, the people from Catherine's other life, lieutenants, enemies, informants, soldiers who know her not as the awkward, overdressed in the wrong way sister but as the Warlord Queen, a name the film leans into with a dangerous, almost mythic weight every time someone from her underworld past says it out loud, like they're invoking a storm. The film, on paper, has a simple hook: two sisters, abandoned as kids, take completely different paths in life. Grace reinvents herself into something palatable to the upper class, a sort of self-made success story who's just managed to break into the world that once sneered at her, and Catherine vanishes into the shadows and comes back as, well, essentially a ruthless, highly strategic crime lord and paramilitary leader operating in the global grey zones where governments, corporations, and warlords overlap. And if that sounds over the top, that's because it is, but the film leans into the operatic nature of that contrast with full commitment, grounding it not in realism but in emotional truth. We don't spend half the movie watching Catherine climb the criminal ladder step by step, we're just dropped into the present where she already is the Warlord Queen, and we piece together how she became this myth through flashbacks, whispers, and the rare vulnerable moment where the mask slips. But structurally, the movie orbits almost entirely around one night, Grace's engagement party, this lush, shimmering social event in an old estate with chandeliers, champagne towers, and a string quartet playing pop songs you almost recognize, the kind of party that's basically a stage for class performance, for people to show off how far they've come, and for others to measure them and quietly rip them to shreds. The brilliance of the opening act is in how it sets up the sisters' world before that night, and it does it with this hazy, sun-bleached prologue of their childhood. We see the Blackwood sisters as kids in the late 90s or early 2000s, sitting on cracked concrete steps outside some cramped apartment, Catherine maybe 12, Grace around 8, their parents shouting bleeding through the walls like static, and then one morning, just silence, an empty apartment, a note on the table with not even an apology, just a couple of crumpled bills and an address of a foster home scribbled like an afterthought. And Mara Kincaid doesn't linger on the hallmark version of abandonment. There's no dramatic music swell, no slow-motion hug, just confusion. Young Catherine checking the bathroom, calling out their parents' names, young Grace clutching a stuffed animal that's missing an eye, asking what's happening, and then the next shot is them in the back of a car, the city blurring outside, and Catherine staring straight ahead in this way that already hints at the cold, calculating person she'll become, while Grace rests her head on her shoulder like that's the only stable piece of the world she has left. These early flashes are intercut later throughout the movie. They come back in fragments at key emotional moments instead of as one long flashback sequence, and that choice works so well because it mirrors the way trauma often lives in our minds, not in neat chronological order, but in sudden, intrusive images synced to whatever's triggering us in the present. And as we move into the present-day timeline, we see how those formative years hardened Catherine and softened Grace in different ways. Grace grows up chasing normalcy, chasing stability, studying like her life depends on it, learning how to straighten her hair just right, how to fold her accent away into something neutral, how to carry herself in rooms where people want you to prove you belong. And Isla Hart nails this fragile performance of confidence. She's successful, she's engaged to a rich, handsome man, she's about to join a powerful family. But you can tell with every lingering half-smile that she's still waiting to be found out, to be told, sorry, you don't actually belong here. Catherine, on the other hand, vanishes from the system as soon as she ages out. The film hints that she bounced through foster homes, juvenile detention, odd jobs, made some desperate choices, and somewhere along the way, discovered she had a terrifying talent for reading people, strategizing, and using violence as a precise tool instead of a blunt instrument. And it's here that the world of the film expands into this global, almost comic bookish crime map. We get news reports about a Mysterious figure only known as the Warlord Queen, destabilizing militias in one region, outmaneuvering corrupt officials in another, reshaping black market routes, and you kind of expect the movie to turn into a full-on crime epic. But what's clever is that Mara Kincaid doesn't fully explain the mechanisms of Catherine's empire, and that will understandably frustrate some viewers who wanted a gritty, grounded breakdown of how a parentless girl from a broken home turns into an internationally feared player. But from a thematic perspective, the film cares less about logistics and more about energy. Catherine is what happens when a girl who's been powerless her whole life finally grabs power with both hands and refuses to let go, and that power, like any other, is complicated, bloody, not entirely righteous, but when placed against the genteel cruelty of upper-class ridicule later in the film, it becomes deeply cathartic. Our main story properly kicks off on the morning of Grace's engagement party, and this is where the movie slides into its present-day rhythm, with the camera waking up alongside Grace in this perfectly curated little apartment that looks like a magazine spread, all soft colors and textures, but the first thing we hear is her alarm blaring a cheap, obnoxious sound, not some elegant classical tune, a small reminder that underneath the Instagram perfect veneer there's still someone who came from chaos and noise, someone who hasn't fully recalibrated to this new world. She knocks the alarm off, gets up, and we follow her through a pre-party routine that's half nervy checklist, half prayer. She tries on her dress, rehearses her speech, practices her future last name in the mirror, stumbles on it, laughs it off, but the laugh is a little too loud, too forced, and Isla Hart infuses all of this with the sense of someone playing a role she's not sure she deserves. Damien, the fiancé, shows up, handsome in that generically expensive way, dropping kisses on her forehead and making casual comments like, "My mother's a little intense, but you'll be fine, they're going to love you, just don't mention the foster thing unless they bring it up first," and that moment already tells you everything about the fault line in this relationship. He's not malicious yet, he's not twirling a mustache, but he's asking her to edit her past into something consumable, to make her origin story palatable, and the movie is very interested in that, in the idea of being forced to curate your story so that people who've never gone hungry can still look you in the eye. Grace, at this point, has already sent Catherine an invitation to the party, and we see that in a quick scene earlier. She's staring at her phone, at an unsent message thread, debating, then hitting send on a simple text, engaged. Party. I'd like you there. Please. And the three pulsating dots never appear. Catherine doesn't respond, or at least, not that Grace sees, and the film holds off on giving us Catherine's perspective just yet, letting us sit with Grace's disappointment as she tells herself it's fine, that her sister is busy, that she understood what she signed up for when her only family member became a ghost with whispers of violence attached. The engagement party is framed almost like a stage play. It's all set in this Ashford family estate, with rooms that feel like carefully constructed sets where different tensions play out, but before we get there, we actually cut away for the first glimpse of Catherine in the present day, and the tonal whiplash is deliberate. We jump from the warm, pastel anxiety of Grace's world to a cold, concrete underbelly somewhere on the other side of the world, maybe in a docked warehouse or an abandoned factory, and the color grading shifts to steely blues and sickly fluorescence, a sharp visual signpost that we've crossed into Catherine's domain. She's undercover on a mission when we first meet her, posing as a janitor in some heavily guarded corporate compound that's laundering money for a private military contractor. At this point, we don't know all those details, we just know she's pushing a mop bucket down a hallway, face half hidden under a cap, while armed guards stroll by her without a second glance, and the tension here is handled beautifully. The camera lingers on the close-up of her hand, steady but ready, her eyes flicking to every reflection in every window, clocking exits, calculating. There's a moment where one guard calls her, "Hey, cleaning lady," and tosses a gum wrapper on the floor right by her feet, and though she bends to pick it up, there's this micro-expression, a flicker of dark amusement mixed with contempt, that tells you she's filing that away in her mental ledger. And if you've ever seen someone who's actually dangerous pretending to be harmless, you'll recognize that look. The mission quickly escalates, a quick series of moves, a hidden blade, a stolen keycard, turn into a restricted wing, and suddenly we're watching the Warlord Queen do what she does best, orchestrate chaos like a symphony, but always from the edges of the frame because she's still in her janitor disguise, and the movie keeps her true appearance under wraps just a bit longer, almost like it's saving her reveal for when the people who laughed at her will have to see her too. She retrieves some crucial hard drive, sabotages a shipment, takes a silent phone call where a disembodied voice, one of her top lieutenants, says, "There's chatter about your sister." Ashford. Engagement, and she freezes, just for a fraction of a second, in the middle of this high-stakes operation, and it's one of those small storytelling choices I love. The film underlines that no matter how far Catherine's gone, no matter how feared she is, the word sister is still a vulnerability that can cut through the armor. She finishes the mission, walks out past bodies we never even saw fall, disappears into the night, and in the back of her armored SUV, she finally pulls out her phone and sees the invitation Grace sent weeks ago, unread, sitting like a tiny white flag of hope in a sea of encrypted messages and operational warnings, and she just stares at it, thumb hovering, and Rhea Morrison plays this scene in complete silence, no music, just the hum of the car and the city outside, and you see the emotional calculus happening. She's weighing risk, security, optics, but also the thing she would never admit, that she misses her sister and is terrified of the person she's become in front of her. Then the film hard cuts to the Ashford estate that evening, the start of the engagement party, and it's almost jarring how bright it is, strings of lights in manicured gardens, servers balancing trays of hors d'oeuvres, guests arriving in sleek cars, the sound design flooded with laughter that's just a bit too loud, the clink of glass, the murmur of names and money and connections, and Grace in the center of it all, in a dress that's almost but not quite white, symbolically hovering between engagement and wedding, between belonging and still being trial run material. The first act of the party is all about establishing social hierarchies. We watch Grace navigate microaggressions and passive-aggressive compliments, her future mother-in-law Helena swooping in with lines like, "Oh darling, we must do something about that family story for the society pages, we don't want to scare the donors, do we?" There's a painful scene where an old classmate of Grace's, someone who remembers her from the public high school days, corners her and says just a bit too loudly, "I still can't believe it's you, Grace from 9C, remember when your shoes had duct tape?" And the camera immediately finds Helena's tightened smile, Damien's slight flinch, and you know exactly how many points Grace's social stock has just lost in that moment, even as she laughs it off and says, "Yeah, well, look at me now, right?" With a cheeriness that's one breath away from cracking. It's at about this point, when Grace is cutting a celebratory cake shaped like a tiny version of the Ashford estate, when the film lets Catherine enter the scene, and her entrance is not some slow-motion, hair-blowing, gown-sweeping shot, it's the exact opposite, and that's what makes it so effective. The doors at the back of the ballroom open quietly and in shuffles someone who looks like a late-night cleaning staffer who accidentally took a wrong turn, oversized grey coveralls, scuffed shoes, a janitor's ID badge, hair tucked messily under a cap, a mop bucket squeaking loudly enough that people start turning to glare because it's ruining the carefully managed ambience, and for a second, nobody recognizes her, not even Grace. The camera cuts between faces, guests frowning, Helena's eyes narrowing, Damien whispering to an event planner, "I thought we scheduled staff for after midnight," and Grace squinting, head tilted, trying to figure out why this random worker is walking right into the most important night of her life. We, the audience, have already seen Catherine in this costume in the earlier mission, so there's this delicious dramatic irony as people at the party start making snide comments under their breath about the help and security slipping, and it isn't until Catherine gets close enough that we see Grace's face shift from confusion to this stunned, childlike joy. She blurts out, "Cat," and the entire room goes dead quiet, because up until now, Grace has barely mentioned having a sister, and certainly not one who arrives like this. Catherine, still in character, gives this small, lopsided smile, like she's both embarrassed and amused, and it's one of the rare moments she lets herself be reduced, for Grace's sake, playing into the narrative that she's just this lowly cleaner who took whatever job she could get to stop by, and we feel the tension coil because we know she's so much more than that. What follows is one of the movie's most excruciatingly relatable sequences, the bad first impression of the family, ramped up to an almost sadistic degree. Helena swoops in with that poisonous grace, cooing, "Oh, you must be Grace's sister, is it?" How unexpected, I sweeping Catherine's uniform like it's a stain on the party, and there's this sharp moment where one of Grace's old classmates, clearly tipsy and eager to perform for the wealthy crowd, cracks a joke about how clearly you went with different career paths, and Grace gets the prints, you get the toilets, and laughter ripples through the nearest cluster of guests. And this is where the movie hits uncomfortably close to real life, because you can feel how this laughter isn't even fully conscious malice, it's that lazy, thoughtless cruelty that comes from people so secure in their status they forget that the person they are demeaning is still, well, a person, and the way the camera pairs that laughter with close-ups of Grace and Catherine's faces is brutal. Grace looks horrified, torn between defending her sister and not wanting to blow up the delicate social equilibrium she's worked so hard to create, and Isla Hart absolutely sells the micro-tremors of that indecision, her hand half reaching out, then dropping, her voice catching as she stammers, she's been working very hard, she couldn't, change, as if she has to apologize for Catherine's presence. Catherine, meanwhile, is taking in all of this with that same flat, almost clinical gaze we saw in the opening mission, and Rhea Morrison is phenomenal here because she doesn't overplay it. You don't see her getting visibly enraged or flustered, she actually forces a little self-deprecating chuckle, shrugging, somebody's gotta clean up after all this, blending into the role so convincingly that the guests double down, emboldened. But if you pay attention, you'll notice a tiny twitch in her jaw, the slight tightening around her eyes, and you know she's enduring this only because it's Grace's night. The sequence escalates as Helena subtly isolates Catherine in conversation, probing her in that fake interested way rich people do when they are trying to learn your backstory while making you feel small, asking where she lives, what she does, and Catherine, still undercover as a simple worker, gives vague, deflecting answers that Helena willfully misinterprets as proof of her inferiority. One of the film's nastiest little moments is when Helena, glass of champagne in hand, jokes, loudly enough for a handful of bystanders to hear, "Well, darling, at least if the catering staff fails us, we know you can pick up a mop," and for a beat too long, the only sound is the awkward laughter of people who know they are supposed to laugh because Helena is powerful, and in that silence, you can almost hear Catherine's patience snapping thread by thread. All of this would be unbearable if the film didn't also seed in small acts of connection between the sisters. Grace pulls Catherine aside when she can, hugging her so tightly you see Catherine stiffen, caught off guard by genuine affection in the middle of this hostile territory, and they share snippets of conversation that hint at the long years spent apart, at promises broken and sacrifices made. There's a line where Grace says, "I wish you'd told me you were coming, I'd have prepared them," and Catherine replies, a little too softly, "You shouldn't have to prepare anyone for me," and that line lands like a thesis statement for the whole movie, the idea that we feel obligated to soften or explain the people we love so that the world doesn't recoil at them, when in reality maybe the problem isn't the roughness of our loved ones but the fragility of the spaces we're desperate to belong to. But the film doesn't truly explode until Damien himself betrays Grace, and this is where the melodrama cranks up and your mileage may vary depending on how allergic you are to heightened emotional confrontations, because we shift from quiet cruelty to full-scale humiliation. The turning point comes about midway through the party. At the big toast moment, everyone gathers, glasses raised, strings swell, Damien clinks his fork to call for attention, and for a second, it looks like we're headed toward a standard rom-com style speech. He thanks his parents, jokes about how he chased Grace in the office, talks about how she softened him, all very cliché, and Grace beams, cheeks flushed, eyes shining. Then he pivots, in this slick, practiced way, into talking about transparency, about starting a marriage, on equal footing, with no secrets, and you see Grace's smile falter, because she doesn't know where this is going, and neither do we, until he brings up a folder, a literal, physical folder, handed to him by some private investigator his parents hired, and he says things like, "I wanted to believe that none of this mattered, but when you've lied about something so fundamental," and suddenly the room's temperature drops. He reveals, in front of everyone, that he knows the full story of her past, that she changed her last name in college, that she left out certain details of her time in the foster system, that she was once briefly arrested in a protest that went sideways when she was a teenager, details we saw earlier in flashbacks but that Grace has worked so hard to bury because she knows how people like the Ashfords weaponize those narratives, and the way he frames it is so insidious, making it sound like she deceived him instead of acknowledging the power imbalance that made her feel unsafe sharing those things. The red flags that were sprinkled throughout his character, the subtle comments, the little flinches, crystallize in this moment into something undeniably cruel, as he says, "How can I build a life with someone who can't be honest about where she comes from," while literally using her trauma as a prop for his performance of moral outrage, and the camera does this brilliant thing of slowly blurring the background, narrowing into Grace's shock. We hear his words as if underwater, muffled, distorted, because for her, everything is collapsing at once, the room, the future she built in her head, the fragile persona she's been wearing like armor. Damien goes further, implying that he almost went through with it anyway because he loves her, but that he can't ask his family to accept the risk, essentially painting himself as a tragic victim of her supposed lies, and when he formally calls off the engagement right there, in front of everyone, setting down the ring like it's poisoned, you can feel the collective gasp in the theater audience reflected by the extras on screen. People murmur, phones come out, some guests avert their eyes in fake politeness, others watch hungrily, and Helena steps in as if to comfort Grace while simultaneously twisting the knife by saying something like, "We just wish you trusted us, dear," turning the whole thing into a morality play about the perils of not being honest, which, in their vocabulary, means not making them uncomfortable with your real story. It is, without question, one of the most viciously humiliating scenes I've seen in a mainstream drama in a while, and the decision to let it play out in almost real time, with minimal music, is absolutely intentional. Mara Kincaid wants you to sit in that humiliation, to taste the bitterness of it, to recognize not just the cruelty of one man, but the complicity of an entire social structure that sees people like Grace as decor until their past becomes inconvenient. Through all of this, Catherine is in the crowd, quiet, watching, and the camera keeps cutting to her hands. At first, they're at her sides, fingers flexing, then balled into fists, then one hand slipping into her pocket where we catch a glimpse of something metal, a ring, a coin, maybe a weapon, and Rhea Morrison acts the hell out of these silent beats. The mask she's been wearing, the easygoing, self-deprecating janitor act, starts to fracture, and for the first time, we see real emotion flood her face, not just anger, but this raw, guttural mix of rage and helplessness that comes from watching the one person you vow to protect be dragged through the mud while you stand there in a disguise that prevents you from burning it all down. When Grace finally breaks, when the weight of the room's judgment becomes too much, she drops the champagne flute, the sound shattering like a gunshot in the silence, and runs out of the ballroom, tears carving black tracks through her carefully applied makeup. And what absolutely wrecked me is the split-second choice both Damien and Helena make. Neither of them go after her. They let her leave, because at that point, their performance is already complete. They've made their point, secured their moral high ground, and the human being at the center of it is now just collateral. It's Catherine who moves, not immediately, but with the heavy deliberateness of someone stepping across a line she knows she can never uncross. She follows Grace out into a side corridor, all while the party bubbles back to life behind her in this toxic way, people gossiping, speculating, some already editing the story to make themselves sound more sympathetic when they retell it later. The confrontation between the sisters in that corridor is the emotional centerpiece of the movie, and it's where the film's themes about identity, self-erasure, and loyalty crystallize into words. Grace is sobbing, back against the wall, sliding down like her legs can't hold her up anymore, whispering, "I did everything right, I was good, I was small, I didn't make trouble, why isn't it enough?" And if that line doesn't break you a little, you may not have ever contorted yourself to fit into a space that was never designed for you. Catherine kneels in front of her, wipes her face with the roughness of someone who's never learned how to be gentle, and says, "Because their acceptance was never about you, Gracie. It was about the story they could tell about you." Grace lashes out at her then, not because she truly blames Catherine but because trauma always splashes onto the nearest loved one. She accuses Catherine of leaving her, of forcing her to build this fragile life on her own, of never being there when she needed her, and the hurt in those words is palpable. Catherine takes it, every word, flinching but not retreating, and Rhea Morrison plays this scene like a war inside her, the impulse to defend herself warring with the instinct to absorb Grace's pain without deflecting it. She finally whispers, "I thought if I stayed away, if I took the ugly part of our story with me, you'd have a chance at something clean." And that line is so telling, because it reveals that Catherine's whole empire, this terrifying warlord queen persona, was, in her mind, built to carry the darkness so that Grace wouldn't have to, even if that meant Grace believing she'd been abandoned. They're interrupted when one of Grace's former classmates stumbles into the corridor looking for the bathroom, sees them, and instead of offering comfort, laughs nervously and says something like, "Wow, drama follows you girls," her pulling out her phone like she might film it, and Catherine's head snaps around with such a deadly look that the girl bolts. That's the moment you feel something click in Catherine. She straightens up, helps Grace to her feet, and there's this shift in her voice as she says, "You don't have to stay here," and Grace, still clinging to the tattered scraps of her dream, says, "But where would I go? What would I be without this?" And that question lands like a weight. Catherine looks back toward the ballroom, toward the laughter and clinking glasses and polite cruelty, and you see her make the decision. She's going to burn this fantasy down, not just for revenge, but to force Grace to see that the thing she thought she needed was always built on a foundation that would never hold her. When they re-enter the ballroom, time seems to slow, the music softens, people turn to stare, whispers spike. Damien, who's now playing the wounded hero surrounded by sympathetic guests, sees Grace and has the audacity to look apologetic but resolute, like he's the one sacrificing something. Helena steps forward with a hand extended, as if she's about to deliver some gracious, patronizing statement about still supporting Grace, but Catherine steps in front of her sister with a movement so smooth it feels choreographed, and this is the moment the film has been building to, Catherine dropping the disguise. She strips off the janitor cap, letting her hair fall, shrugs out of the ill-fitting coveralls in one fluid motion to reveal beneath them not a glamorous gown, but sleek, functional black clothing that somehow still looks more dangerous and regal than anything in the room, and for the first time, the cinematography frames her as she truly is, centered, backlit, the focal point, no longer shoved to the edges of the shot like a piece of background noise. People murmur, some in recognition, a couple of guests who clearly have ties to the underworld go pale, eyes widening, and one of them whispers, almost reverently, "That's her. That's the Warlord Queen." The name ripples through the crowd like a current, colliding with the casual insults they'd been throwing at her mere minutes earlier. You get quick insert shots of phones buzzing, secret texts going out, power brokers in the room reassessing everything. This is no longer just an engagement party scandal, it's a geopolitical event. Catherine's transformation isn't magical, there's no CGI effect, but the power of performance and framing makes it feel like a superhero reveal. She stands taller, her posture shifts from deferential to commanding, and when she speaks, her voice carries in a way it didn't before, calm and lethal. She doesn't launch into a big monologue right away, instead, she walks slowly, deliberately, across the room, stopping in front of Damien, who swallows hard, suddenly realizing that the woman he humiliated as, from the wrong side of the tracks, has more actual power than his entire family put together. It's here the movie gives us what will undoubtedly become its most quoted line. He stammers something like, "You lied about who you are," and Catherine stares at him with that chilled, almost amused coldness and says, "No. I just let you assume I was small enough for you to handle," then turns to the crowd and adds, "You all did," letting her gaze skate over Helena, the classmates, the whisperers. It's a line that encapsulates the central theme, the world's eagerness to project smallness onto people they deem beneath them, and the quiet, simmering rage of those people when they realize they've been complicit in that shrinking. From here, the movie shifts gears into a kind of climactic reckoning, and it's where some viewers might feel it goes a bit too far into fantasy territory, but personally, I think it earns its operatic flair precisely because it's so grounded in emotional reality up to this point. Catherine doesn't pull out guns and turn the ballroom into an action set piece, which would have been the easy, spectacle-driven route. Instead, she weaponizes information, influence, and fear, the tools she's honed in her life as the Warlord Queen. She calls out specific guests by name, revealing, with surgical precision, the dirty secrets she's collected on them, the tax evasion, the illegal land grabs, the contracts with the very mercenaries her empire has crushed in other regions. Each revelation isn't just a gotcha, it's tied thematically to the way they judged Grace, the man who mocked her shoes as a teen. Catherine casually mentions the underpaid workers in his factories. The woman who joked about toilets. Catherine brings up a sanitation deal her company fixed that poisoned an entire community's water. About Helena and Charles Ashford, she's particularly ruthless, alluding to the offshore accounts and political favors that built their dynasty, making it clear that if she wanted, she could rip their carefully curated legacy to pieces in a matter of hours, and the room reacts accordingly, the shallow disdain they had for her moments ago twisting into primal fear. Grace watches all of this from slightly behind Catherine, shell-shocked. This is the other side of the coin she never fully grasped, the scope of the life her sister's been living. She's both horrified by the ruthlessness and, you can see it, a tiny bit exhilarated by the idea that someone is finally standing up for her with such undeniable force. The film walks a delicate line here, because it doesn't want to fully glorify Catherine's methods. The lighting around her grows harsher, the score brings in low, unsettling tones, reminding us that power, no matter who wields it, carries a cost. After thoroughly dismantling the social standing of several key figures, Catherine turns back to Damien for the personal reckoning. He attempts a last-ditch rationalization, protesting that he had a right to know, and that marriage is a partnership built on truth, but Catherine isn't having it. She steps in close, so close their faces are inches apart, and tells him, quietly enough that only the closest guests and we in the audience can hear, truth without compassion is just cruelty dressed up as virtue, and in that moment, the film crystallizes another core idea, that what he did wasn't about transparency, it was about dominance, about reasserting control when he felt threatened by her history. Catherine then does something unexpected. She doesn't physically retaliate, she doesn't threaten him with her soldiers, though we later realize several of her people have been quietly securing the perimeter. Instead, she turns her back on him and addresses Grace. This is the true climax, not the destruction of Damien or Helena, but the invitation she offers her sister. She says, loud enough for everyone to hear, you don't have to stay here and beg for their scraps anymore. You can walk out with me right now, and there will be a life that is yours, not borrowed, not tolerated. But I won't drag you. You choose. And that choice, that insistence on agency, is what elevates the moment beyond a simple revenge fantasy. Catherine isn't just rescuing Grace, she's demanding Grace recognize her own worth independent of this toxic circle. Grace hesitates, and this is where the pacing takes its time in the best way. The camera lingers on her face as she looks around, really looks, at the people she thought she needed. She sees Helena's mask finally cracking into open disdain, Damien's cowardice laid bare, the guests already pulling away, not wanting to be too close to the shamed woman, and she looks back at Catherine, whose eyes, for all their steel, are wet at the corners. You feel the entire movie hanging on this choice. In a lesser script, Grace might immediately run into her sister's arms with swelling music, but here, she says something more complicated. I don't want your war, Cat. I just want myself. That line is crucial, because it rejects the binary of powerless victim versus ruthless queen. It insists on a third path. Catherine, to her credit, nods, swallowing hard, and replies, then let's go find her, and extends her hand. Grace takes it. And together, in what is genuinely one of the most satisfying shots in the film, they walk out of the ballroom side by side, past the stunned guests, past Helena and Damien, who call after them but receive no response. The camera holds on their intertwined hands as they cross the threshold, and the music finally lets itself swell, not with a triumphant superhero theme, but with this bittersweet, almost mournful melody that acknowledges what they're leaving behind, not just the toxic people, but Grace's dream of what she thought her life would be. Outside, in the cold night air, a convoy of vehicles waits, not limos, but armored SUVs bearing the trademarks of Catherine's underworld. Her lieutenants step out, bowing their heads in a show of respect that feels almost feudal, and Grace flinches slightly, realizing just how big of a shadow she's stepping into. The sisters have a quiet conversation by the car that hints at the film's more complex moral questions. Grace asks, how many people are afraid of you? And Catherine answers, enough, then adds, after a beat, too many. She admits, in halting words, that she's lost herself somewhere in the Warlord Queen persona, that she doesn't know how to be just Catherine anymore, and that part of the reason she came tonight was a selfish one. She wanted to remember who she was when she was just an older sister sharing a broken bed with a terrified little girl in a too-cold apartment. This self-awareness is what keeps the movie from fully romanticizing her power. We're allowed to revel in the catharsis of her putting snobs in their place, but we're also reminded that her empire is built on violence, on fear, and that it's taken pieces of her she may never get back. The final act of the movie, which I'll only touch on in broad strokes to avoid spoiling every beat, shifts away from the ballroom and into the aftermath of that night. We follow the ripples, the Ashfords scrambling to contain the PR disaster, politicians making frantic phone calls about being seen with an international warlord, gossip sites exploding with headlines like, engagement party from hell, and, who is the Warlord Queen, and, more importantly, we watch the sisters attempt to negotiate what their relationship looks like now that their worlds have violently collided. Grace goes with Catherine for a while, not to become her right hand in crime, but because she has nowhere else to go. Her job in Damien's family-adjacent company evaporates overnight, friends abandon her, and she's suddenly adrift, back to feeling like the foster kid the world thinks it can discard. The film spends crucial time showing her discomfort in Catherine's world. She flinches at the casual presence of guns, questions the loyalty of Catherine's people, recoils when she sees the kind of calls Catherine has to make, including one chilling scene where Catherine signs off on a necessary but morally ambiguous operation to neutralize a rival group that might threaten Grace as a way of lashing out at anyone remotely connected to the Ashfords. Grace confronts her about it, accusing her of using her pain as an excuse to cause more pain, and that conflict is important, because it interrogates our own enjoyment of the revenge in the earlier act. It asks, at what point does catharsis turn into cruelty? Cinematically, these later scenes are drenched in more shadows, neon reflections, the kind of stylized nighttime cityscapes that feel half real, half nightmare, and the score shifts too, bringing in more electronic pulses under the orchestral themes, signaling that we've left the familiar territory of ballrooms and into liminal, dangerous space. One of the film's strongest late sequences is a simple, quiet one, Catherine and Grace in a safe house kitchen at 3 a.m., eating instant ramen out of chipped bowls because Grace insisted on cooking something normal, and they fall into old habits, bickering about silly things like how much chili to add, before the conversation turns serious. Grace admits that part of her chased the Ashford dream not just because she wanted safety, but because she wanted proof that their parents were wrong to leave them, that they could become better than the mess they came from. Catherine confesses that every territory she seized, every rival she outsmarted, was, in some twisted way, her version of that same quest, proof that they were worth more than abandonment. It's here the movie really crystallizes its exploration of how trauma can send siblings down widely divergent paths that are, at their core, driven by the same wound. Performance-wise, Rhea Morrison and Isla Hart are exceptional in these quieter scenes. The heightened drama of the party is fun, but it's the soft, afraid smiles over steaming bowls of noodles that make them feel like real sisters, not just archetypes. As for the film's pacing, this is where some people might feel it drags a bit. After the explosive engagement party climax, the more introspective final act can feel like a come-down, but I think it's necessary. Without it, the movie would end on a high of pure vengeance, which might be entertaining but wouldn't be honest to the complexity it sets up. Instead, it uses this time to explore whether the sisters can forge a life that isn't defined solely by reacting to what was done to them, by either rich abusers or absent parents or corrupt systems. There are still thriller elements. The Ashfords don't just sit back and do nothing, and we see hints of law enforcement and shadowy agencies circling Catherine now that her identity has been inadvertently broadcast to half the country, but those external threats are primarily there to pressure the sisters into making choices about who they want to be. On a thematic level, My Sister is the Warlord Queen is juggling a lot: class, gender, power, family, trauma, the narratives we construct to survive, and whether we can step outside them. Some critics will undoubtedly argue that it bites off more than it can chew, and there are definitely moments where the script veers into on-the-nose territory, a couple of lines spelled out ideas that were already clear from the performances, but the emotional sincerity behind it keeps it from feeling preachy. The class commentary is particularly sharp. The film doesn't just pit poor good people against rich bad people. It shows how institutions of wealth are designed to extract authenticity from people like Grace and then weaponize it against them, while simultaneously romanticizing figures like Catherine when it suits them, treating her like an exotic story until they realize how real the stakes are. One of my favorite touches is the way social media is woven into the narrative. We catch glimpses of partygoers' screens as they film, their feeds turning Grace's lowest moment and Catherine's reveal into content, and later, we see how the internet mythologizes the Warlord Queen, turning her into memes, TikTok sounds, and hashtags. This speaks to the cultural moment we're in, where stories of humiliation and revenge get commodified in real time, and where people's very real trauma is turned into entertainment grist. Performance-wise, beyond the leads, Cassandra Leon as Helena is chilling. She embodies that brand of refined, generational cruelty that never raises its voice but can destroy lives with a shrug, and there's a late scene where she appears on a news program, spinning the events of the party into a narrative where her family is the victim of a dangerous criminal infiltrating their home, that shows just how adept people like her are at narrative control. William Hayes as Charles is more subdued but equally complicit, the kind of man who hides behind his wife's aggression and his lawyer's contracts, and Callum Reeves brings just enough vulnerability to Damien that you believe he doesn't see himself as a villain, which makes his actions all the more chilling. He's not a cartoon, he's a product of a system that taught him his comfort is more important than anyone else's dignity. On the technical side, the cinematography by Lin Nguyen is standout. The contrast between Grace's warm, soft-lit aspirational spaces and Catherine's cool, harshly lit operational world isn't subtle, but it's effective. and the way those palettes start to bleed into each other after the party, Grace framed in sharper shadows, Catherine in softer domestic light, visually reinforces their emotional arcs. The editing is tight in the first two acts, especially during the party, where micro-reactions are cut together like a dance, but the third act, as I mentioned, loosens its tempo, which I think works narratively but may test the patience of viewers expecting a straight thriller. The score by Odile Marsh deserves special mention. It weaves in a leitmotif built around a simple, melancholic piano line that first appears in the childhood flashbacks and then returns in twisted variations during key moments, sometimes played by strings at the party, sometimes distorted electronically in Catherine's world, subtly tying the sisters' emotional states together even when they are worlds apart. Audience reaction-wise, this movie is primed to be talkative. It's the kind of film you walk out of wanting to debrief with someone, to parse who was right in certain arguments, to vent about how much you wanted to scream at Damien, to confess the part of you that felt an almost guilty satisfaction watching Catherine verbally eviscerate those who mocked her. I can see certain scenes, especially Catherine's, small enough for you to handle, line and Grace's, "I just want myself," line, becoming the kind of quote graphics that circulate widely, used as personal anthems by people who felt similarly reduced or trapped. At the same time, I think it will spark nuanced conversation about the limits of revenge fantasy. Some viewers will love the heightened nature of Catherine's power, while others will question whether making her a literal warlord complicates the empowerment message, and that's a fair critique. The film doesn't fully reconcile Catherine's role in global violence with the personal catharsis it offers, and whether you see that as intentionally thorny or as a cop-out will depend on your tolerance for moral ambiguity in your protagonists. Personally, I appreciate that the movie doesn't try to give us a neat bow. The ending, which I won't spoil in full detail, doesn't see Catherine magically reforming or dismantling her empire overnight. Instead, it hints at small, specific changes she's willing to make for Grace's sake, and at Grace beginning to assert herself not just in opposition to the Ashfords but also to Catherine, refusing to be anyone's project or symbol. In the final scenes, we see Grace taking concrete steps toward building a life that blends her desire for stability with an honest embrace of her past, reconnecting with others from the foster system, considering a career that uses her experiences to advocate for kids like she once was, and doing so not from a place of shame but from a place of hard-won self-acceptance. Catherine, meanwhile, stands on a rooftop, looking over a city she effectively rules from the shadows, and for the first time, she seems uncertain, not of her power, but of its purpose. The last shot of the movie is a quiet one, the two sisters side by side on that rooftop, no giant declarations, just a shared look that says, "We survived. We're still figuring it out." The camera pulls back, their figures getting smaller against the sprawling lights, and that, I think, is the film's most honest admission. In a world that keeps trying to make you small, sometimes the bravest thing you can do is stand next to the one person who remembers you in all your messy, ugly, beautiful totality and say, "We're not done." My Sister is the Warlord Queen is not a perfect film. It's sprawling in its ideas, occasionally heavy-handed in its symbolism, and its central conceit, that your sister is basically a geopolitical boss, asks you to suspend a fair bit of disbelief. But what makes it stick, what's had me thinking about it long after the credits rolled, isn't the spectacle of that reveal or the satisfaction of seeing snobs humbled, though those are undeniably fun. It's the ache under all of that, the portrait of two women shaped by the same wound who spent their lives running in opposite directions, only to realize they can't actually heal without turning back toward each other. In a media landscape saturated with stories about lone wolves and individual revenge, it's refreshing to see a film that centers sisterhood so intensely, that says, yes, you can build an empire on your own, you can storm the castle alone, but the question is, who do you want standing next to you when the dust settles? And for all its guns and secrets and high society drama, that's ultimately what this movie cares about, not the warlord, not the queen, but the word in the middle of its title that quietly holds the whole thing together, sister. And the more I sit with this movie, the more it feels like one of those stories that reveals different layers every time you replay it in your head, because on a first watch you're just riding the emotional roller coaster, the humiliation at the engagement party, the gut punch of Damien's betrayal, the goosebumps when Catherine rips off that janitor uniform and stops pretending to be small, but on a second pass, you start noticing all the tiny choices, all the quiet setups that make those big explosions of feeling actually land, and you realize my sister is the Warlord Queen is constructed like a long fuse that's constantly being lit and relit through micro moments of disrespect and love, of shame and defiance, until the explosion at that party feels both shocking and inevitable, like the only way all that bottled up history could ever express itself. One detail that really jumped out at me on rewatch is how much the film uses objects as emotional anchors, like the mop, the ring, the phone, the shoes. They are not just props, they are like little emotional totems that carry all the weight the characters can't say out loud, and the cinematography keeps coming back to them. Think about the mop. It's introduced in that early undercover mission, when Catherine is gliding through a hostile compound, using the most overlooked object in the room as a kind of Trojan horse, pushing it past guards who never bother to look up at her face because they assume cleaning staff means non-threat. And then that same mop is with her in the ballroom, squeaking across polished marble floors while people grimace, and the camera lingers not just on the bucket but on the smear of dirty water it leaves behind, like an uninvited truth staining this perfectly curated world. When the classmates laugh, when Helena makes her cutting jokes, it's all happening around that mop, and you start to see it not just as a symbol of low status, but as this ironic crown Catherine's chosen to wear, almost like she's testing them. Will you see me now? Or will you still only see the mop? And then later, when she drops the mop, when it clatters loudly in the middle of the room just as she's about to reveal herself, it's like she's shedding the last layer of camouflage, saying, I'm done cleaning up your mess. The ring operates as a kind of inverse symbol. It's presented early on as this glittering, aspirational object. We see Grace turning her hand under the light, practicing signing her new last name with that ring on, even rehearsing how to show it casually in conversation, the way people do when they are newly engaged and low-key thrilled to have this physical proof that they've been chosen. But the movie is smart about undercutting that glow. There's a scene before the party where Grace is alone, and she wrenches the ring off for a second, rubbing the indentation it's already made on her finger, and the camera zooms in just enough that you see the faint red mark, not painful yet, but visible, like the early bruise of a pressure you're trying not to acknowledge. After Damien's public betrayal, when he sets that ring on the table like he's returning a defective product, the sound of metal on glass is unnaturally loud, and the camera shows it no longer in the context of romance but as an object stripped of meaning, this tiny, expensive circle that suddenly feels like a shackle he's decided she's not worthy of wearing. The way Catherine looks at that ring in the aftermath, and this is such a subtle beat, feels loaded. She glances at it, eyes narrowing, and you get the sense she's always hated how much weight Grace gave to that little piece of metal, how it became the symbol of safety in a world that's never really been safe to them. There's a beautiful, almost blink and you miss it callback in the final act, when Grace is starting to rebuild herself. She's at a thrift store, looking at a cheap tray of old costume jewelry, and she picks up a battered, fake gold ring, weighing it in her hand, then sets it back down with a small, decisive smile. It's not a big, underlined moment, there's no dramatic speech, but that gesture says, I'm not measuring my worth in this shape anymore, and it's so quietly powerful. Then there's the phone, honestly one of the most emotionally brutal recurring symbols in the film, because for these sisters, so much of their pain is wrapped up in missed calls, unsent messages, years of silence broken by tiny, tentative digital gestures. When the movie shows us Grace sending that engagement invite, the way her thumb hovers, the way she types, I'd like you there, and then erases it, replaces it with something more neutral, then finally adds, please, back in, it's not just about one text, it's about a lifetime of her trying to be palatable, even to her own sister, softening the sharp edges of her needs so she doesn't seem too much. On Catherine's end, that unread message sitting among encrypted operational chats is basically the emotional heart of the film. She stares at it for so long it times out her phone's screen, and when she lights it back up, the text is still there, patient, waiting, like Grace always has been somewhere in her mind. There's this gutting parallel later on, after the party, when Grace is hiding in a safe house room, scrolling through her old message threads with Damien, reading all the I love you's that now feel like lies, and in another room, Catherine is going through her own phone, but instead of romance, she's reading old intel, threat assessments about the Ashford family, about politicians at the party, and she reaches the same conclusion from a completely different angle. None of these people ever saw Grace as a person, only as a tool or a trophy. The way their two phones light up their faces in darkness, one illuminated by the cold glow of failed love, the other by the cold glow of power, drives home just how far apart their coping mechanisms have taken them, even though they are shaped by the same abandonment. And then, the shoes. those duct-taped high school shoes that get brought up by Grace's classmate at the party aren't just a throwaway humiliation. In one of the very first flashbacks, we see young Grace meticulously wrapping tape around torn soles, embarrassed but determined to make them last, and Catherine kneeling beside her, saying, "People don't look at your feet, they look at your face. So walk like you own the hallway and no one will notice." It's a tender moment of big sister wisdom that clearly doesn't fully protect Grace from the cruelty of other kids, but you see her trying. Years later, at the engagement party, when the classmate mocks those shoes, we're not just seeing a snobby comment, we're seeing Grace being dragged back to that hallway, being told that no matter how expensive her heels are now, she'll always be duct tape girl to some people. That's why it's so satisfying in the final sequence when Grace, now in Catherine's world but starting to carve her own path, walks into a meeting wearing sneakers, not glamorous, not trying to impress, and doesn't flinch when a couple of hardened Warlord-adjacent types look her up and down skeptically. She's learned that the power in her walk was never about hiding the broken soles, it was about claiming space even when you know the floor underneath you is cracked. Cinematically, those object motifs are part of a larger pattern of visual storytelling that makes this film feel so immersive. The camera work is often handheld in the childhood flashbacks, jittery, close, sometimes slightly out of focus, mirroring the instability of their early lives, while the engagement party is all smooth dolly shots and long, elegant takes that glide through the crowd, emphasizing how rehearsed and choreographed that world is. Catherine's underworld scenes, meanwhile, oscillate between those two styles. Sometimes the camera moves with the same sleek confidence she does, other times it whips around abruptly when things go sideways, reminding you that for all her control, she operates in chaos. One neat directorial choice is how doors are shot throughout the film. Doors in the foster system are heavy, half open, with the girls peeking through to overhear whether they are being placed or moved. Doors in the Ashford estate are giant and always open during the party, but they lead to rooms where Grace is still never truly welcome, while doors in Catherine's world are steel, keypad locked, but she has the codes. The progression of doors basically tells the story of who holds access and who's stuck waiting in the hallway, and in the end, when the sisters stand on that rooftop with no doors at all, just open sky, it's like the film is saying, there's no frame around them anymore. For the first time, their next step isn't being decided in a room they are not allowed into. Emotionally, what keeps looping back in my mind is how the film handles the theme of performance. Almost every character is performing some version of themselves that's been shaped by what they think will keep them safe. Grace performs the good girl, the perfect fiancée, the redeemer of the Ashford brand. She laughs too loudly at Helena's jokes, she over-apologizes when someone bumps into her, she keeps her posture perfect, watching everyone else and mirroring them like she's learned to do from years of code switching in environments where one wrong word could label her trouble. Catherine performs the villain, the warlord, the myth. She leans into the title others gave her because in a lot of the spaces she's moved through, it's safer to be feared than pitied, and she's decided vulnerability is something she can't afford. Helena performs the benevolent matriarch, the philanthropist, even as she wields her influence like a weapon. Damien performs the enlightened modern man, proud to marry outside his class, as long as the story looks clean in the press releases. The engagement party becomes a stage where all these performances clash and crack, and what's so satisfying is that the person who's been coded as the biggest liar, Catherine, the one living a double life, is actually the one who ends up telling the most brutal truth, while the people who preach honesty are exposed as liars about their own motives. That doesn't mean Catherine is some pure truth teller, far from it. The film is clear that she's built an entire mythology around herself, that she's selectively narrated her rise to power in ways that are convenient, even heroic, omitting the collateral damage and the compromises. There's a late scene where one of her closest lieutenants, an older man who's known her since her early days in the underworld, gently calls her out. He says something like, "You talk about saving her from the dirt, but we both know some of the mud on your boots is there because you stepped where you didn't have to," and for a split second, you see the defensiveness flash across her face before it softens into something like shame. She's not just the avenging angel the movie invites us to cheer for, she's also a deeply traumatized person who sometimes conflates destruction with protection. That messy duality is what keeps her compelling. Grace's arc is equally nuanced. On the surface, you might be tempted to see her purely as a victim of her parents, of the foster system, of Damien and the Ashfords, but the film resists keeping her in that box. It shows the ways she's complicit in her own erasure, the choices she makes to hide parts of herself, not just out of fear but out of a genuine, often internalized belief that those parts are shameful. The scene where she practices her family story for the society pages, rewriting her childhood into this vague, sanitized version where her parents moved around a lot for work, and she always dreamed of stability, is kind of heartbreaking because you can see how good she's gotten at lying about herself in socially acceptable ways. When Catherine later confronts her about this, accusing her of killing off their younger selves just to impress people who would drop her the second she stops being useful, Grace fires back, "And what did you do, Cat? You took that same little girl and turned her into a weapon so sharp you can't touch anything without cutting it." That argument is one of the film's best written scenes because it refuses to let either sister sit comfortably in the moral high ground. They are both right and both wrong at the same time, and it's only when they admit that any healing becomes possible. In terms of performances, one thing I really appreciate is how physical the acting is, especially with Rhea Morrison as Catherine. She doesn't just deliver badass lines and smolder, she carries the character's entire history in her body language. Watch how she sits when she's in Warlord mode, slightly leaned back, shoulders relaxed, like a queen on a throne, even if the throne is just a plastic chair in a dingy warehouse. Then see how she sits when she's alone with Grace in more vulnerable moments, hunched forward, elbows on knees, hands fidgeting with whatever's in reach, suddenly looking younger, smaller, almost like the teenager who never fully grew out of that hypervigilant slouch. There's this one shot where she and Grace are in a car driving away from the estate. Grace is staring out the window, mascara smeared, and Catherine is drumming her fingers on the steering wheel like she's in battle mode, but when Grace's voice cracks as she asks, "Do you think they're glad we're gone?" Catherine's fingers stop dead, her whole torso stills, and she takes this small, almost inaudible breath before answering in a steady voice, "They were never our people to begin with." It's a tiny physical pause that tells you how hard she has to work to keep that voice steady. Isla Hart, as Grace, brings a different kind of physicality. She's all nervous energy, smoothing her dress, tucking hair behind her ear, checking her reflection in reflective surfaces like she's constantly making sure her mask is still on. After the party, those habits start to fall away. There's a small but significant shift where she stops automatically apologizing when someone brushes past her in Catherine's compound, where she walks into a meeting room without waiting at the door to be invited, where she lets her hair go curly instead of straightening it into the professional version she thought the Ashfords wanted. These may sound like small details, but on screen they are huge, because they show that her growth isn't just about big speeches, it's about the 100 little ways she stops asking permission to exist. One sequence that really deepens both performances is the mid-film flashback to their first big separation, which the movie holds back until after the engagement party, almost like it doesn't want to give you that missing puzzle piece until you've really felt the weight of their present-day dynamic. We're taken back to the day Catherine officially ages out of the system. She's 18, Grace is 14, and they're being split into different placements because, as the social worker bluntly puts it, we don't have room to take them as a unit. They are sitting on plastic chairs in a drab office, duffel bags at their feet, and we watch as the reality dawns on them. This isn't just another temporary home change, this is a real fork in the road. Young Grace begs Catherine not to go, promising she'll find a way to follow her, while young Catherine, already hardened, already seeing how little the system cares, puts on this false bravado, telling Grace she'll be fine, that she just has to stay out of trouble and keep her head down until they can reunite. But the camera lingers on Catherine's hands, clenched on the duffel strap so tightly her knuckles are white, and on the way her eyes keep darting to the clock, like she's counting down the seconds until someone else decides their fate again. When the social worker calls Catherine's name and she stands, the look she and Grace share practically foreshadows the entire movie: terror, love, desperation, and, underneath it all, a shared stubbornness that says, "This isn't the end of us." That memory retroactively colors everything that happens later: Grace's fury at being abandoned, Catherine's guilt-driven need to control every threat around her, their tendency to blame themselves for decisions made by people with more power. It's a reminder that you can build whole empires out of survival skills you learned on days like that, but you never quite outrun the kid who watched your only safe person walk out of a cheap office door. Pacing-wise, the inclusion of that flashback in the second half, instead of upfront, is a risky choice, but I think it pays off because by then we're hungry to understand the root of their distance. It lands with far more force once we've already seen the worst night of their adult lives. It's also a great example of how the film plays with time without losing emotional clarity. The non-linear bits aren't there to be flashy, they're there to put the right emotional information in your hands at the right moment. On a cultural level, I can already imagine the kind of conversations this movie is going to kick up, especially around class and respectability politics. Grace's storyline is a pretty clear indictment of the idea that if you just work hard enough, dress right, talk right, you'll be accepted by the upper echelons. The film shows, over and over, that for some people, no amount of polishing will be enough because they've already decided where you belong. The way Helena and Damien weaponize Grace's past, not because it's actually harmful, but because it threatens their image, mirrors a lot of real-world stories where institutions exploit someone's rags to riches narrative when it makes for good PR, then disavow them the second their ragged parts become inconvenient. Catherine's arc, on the other hand, is going to appeal to audiences who are tired of playing nice in systems that were never built for them. She's the fantasy of what happens when you stop trying to win by their rules and you build your own table, your own army, your own empire. But the movie is smart enough not to fully endorse either path as the solution. It's telling that we never see some big scene where the foster system is fixed, or where the Ashfords get carted off to jail and justice is perfectly served, because in real life, unjust systems rarely get wrapped up with a bow. What we do see is something smaller but arguably more powerful, two women deciding they're not going to let those systems define the story they tell themselves about who they are. In terms of audience reaction, I can imagine very different sectors latching onto different parts of the movie. There's the crowd that will be there for the pure vibe of it, the aesthetic contrast between marble ballrooms and neon-lit warehouses, the badass lines, the slow-motion walkouts. They're going to quote Catherine like she's a video game boss you're half in love with and half terrified of. Then there's the audience that will quietly connect with Grace, maybe a little too closely, seeing their own contortions to fit in mirrored in her, feeling called out by the ways she shrinks herself, and hopefully also feeling seen by the way she slowly, painfully starts to take up space again. There's a good chance this movie ends up all over Stan Twitter and fan-edit TikTok, with compilations of the sisters' most intense moments cut to melancholic pop songs, intercut with people talking about their own sibling dynamics, their own experiences being underestimated at fancy events where they felt like intruders. As a reviewer, what gets me most excited is that for all its dramatic flourishes, my sister is the Warlord Queen understands something deeply human, that the relationships we have with our siblings, or the people who fill that role, are often the longest-running stories of our lives, the ones that stretch across the most different versions of ourselves. We meet our siblings when we're kids, we grow into teenagers together, we diverge as adults, we hurt each other, we save each other, we become unrecognizable to the person who shared a bunk bed with us, and yet, there's this invisible thread that can yank us back into orbit no matter how far we've drifted. This movie takes that familiar, mundane truth and blows it up to mythic proportions. What if your estranged older sister isn't just a different kind of adult, she's literally a Warlord Queen? What if the person you always saw as a bit of a screw-up is secretly the most powerful figure in the room? It's a wild, heightened premise, but it taps into a very real feeling so many of us have had at family gatherings, where you look around and realize everyone is playing a role, everyone is being seen through a distorted lens of childhood memory, and no one in that room actually knows the totality of who you've become. That's what makes the engagement party such a perfect centerpiece. It's a socially acceptable theater of family, where masks are required, and Catherine's decision to rip hers off in such a spectacular way is the narrative equivalent of that relative who finally says the thing everyone's been dancing around for years, except, in this case, that relative also has the resources to back up her words with world-shifting consequences. And honestly, from a pure movie nerd standpoint, I love how shamelessly melodramatic it all is. This is not a subtle film in its big moments, and it doesn't apologize for that. It knows that humiliation and rage and love and betrayal are huge, messy emotions, and it goes big with them. The music swells, the camera swoops, people make pronouncements that in real life would feel over the top, but in the heightened emotional logic of cinema, they feel just right. There's a long tradition of what you might call operatic family drama. Think of films where a wedding or a funeral or a holiday dinner becomes the site of generational warfare, and My Sister is the Warlord Queen slots right into that lineage with its own twist. It's like if you took the social warfare of something like Succession, mixed it with the sisterly ferocity of Little Women, then dropped in the shadow power vibes of a crime epic. In the hands of a less confident director, that tonal cocktail could be a disaster, but Mara Kincaid seems to understand that the key isn't to downplay the ridiculousness, it's to believe in it so earnestly that the audience does too. That commitment is what allows the movie to pull off moments like Catherine, still in her janitor suit, being laughed at by people who have no idea how close they are to ruin. That's a scenario straight out of a comic book, and yet, because the emotional underpinnings are so grounded, it feels less like camp and more like a cathartic fever dream. By the time we reach the end, with the sisters on that rooftop, you've ridden such an intense emotional wave that the quietness of that final image almost feels jarring, but in the best way. There's no orchestral crescendo, no voiceover telling you what happens next, just the distant hum of the city and the kind of silence that sits between two people who have said everything terrible and everything loving they could possibly say, and are now just there, together, breathing the same air, both exhausted and relieved. It's the kind of ending that invites you to imagine 100 different futures. Maybe Catherine slowly dismantles parts of her empire, maybe she doubles down but with a new moral compass, maybe Grace becomes a bridge between the world of the forgotten and the world of quiet power, maybe they fight again and reconcile again and keep doing that for the rest of their lives. The point isn't that we get a neat epilogue, it's that for the first time since that office door slammed all those years ago, they are on the same side of it. So when I think about whether My Sister is the Warlord Queen is worth your time, I don't just think about whether the plot is airtight or the themes are flawlessly executed, I think about how it made me feel, sitting in the dark, hearing people around me gasp, laugh nervously, mutter under their breath when Damien pulled that folder, hearing a couple of quiet sniffles when Grace asked if she'd done something wrong by wanting more than survival. I think about the person 2 rows back who whispered, "That's me," when Catherine said, "I just let you assume I was small," and the ripple that went through the room when Grace chose to walk out, alone but not really alone. I think about the way it made me reflect on the roles I've played in my own life, the version of me that shows up for family, the version in professional spaces, the version with old friends, and which of those are actually me and which are armor. That, to me, is the mark of a film that does more than just entertain, it gets under your skin a little, rearranges something, even if you can't quite name what. And if you're someone who's ever felt underestimated, who's ever been laughed at for the way you showed up to a room, who's ever swallowed your story because you were afraid it would be used against you, My Sister is the Warlord Queen offers you a kind of cinematic fantasy, not that you have to become a Warlord Queen yourself, but that you're allowed to stop shrinking, to stop cleaning up everyone else's mess quietly in the background, and to walk, maybe for the first time, as if you own your own hallway, your own story, your own life. And the more I sat with that question, the more I realized the movie isn't just using Catherine's reveal as a fireworks finale, it's using it as a lens that forces you to replay everything that happened before and notice how many small permissions the room granted itself the moment it decided Catherine was less than, because humiliation never begins with the big laugh, it begins with the first person who chooses not to introduce you properly, the first person who lets you stand alone with a plate in your hands like your furniture, the first person who smiles at you without warmth because they've already filed you away into a category that doesn't require empathy. And what My Sister is the Warlord Queen does so well is it makes you feel how quickly that category hardens into policy, how fast a room can become a machine that processes a human being into an object, and then it asks you to watch Grace standing in the middle of that machine, trying to act like she's operating it when really she's being operated too, because for Grace, those in-laws and that fiancé represent the dream of never being abandoned again, and it's terrifying to realize the dream is built on conditions, and the conditions are basically, stay quiet, stay grateful, stay small, stay palatable, and don't ever bring your real life into our curated space. That's why the janitor outfit is such a brutal narrative choice, not only because it's an easy excuse for cruelty, but because it's the ultimate test of whether Grace's new world has any room for the old one. And if you've ever been the person who made it out, you know that pressure. You know the strange guilt of wanting to protect your roots while also wanting to bury them, not because you hate where you came from, but because you remember how much it hurt to be treated like you came from nowhere, and you start believing that if you can just erase every visible trace of that nowhere, people will finally treat you like you belong somewhere. The film captures that psychology in little ways that are almost too real, like the way Grace corrects Catherine's posture with a tiny gesture, not out of malice, but out of panic, like she's trying to keep the room from smelling poverty on them, or the way she rushes Catherine toward the edges of the party under the pretense of, let's talk later, when what she really means is, please don't become the center of attention in the wrong way, and it's painful because Catherine isn't doing anything wrong by existing, she's just failing to perform the right kind of existence for people who think they own the rules. And because this is a review script and not me just retelling the plot beat for beat, I want to linger on how the movie uses sound to make social violence feel physical, because that's one of the most cinematic things it does. There's this constant texture of clinking glasses, soft laughter, polite applause, background music that's supposed to signal celebration, and the film slowly turns those sounds into a kind of static that drowns out Grace's ability to think, and in scenes where Catherine is being mocked, the laughter is mixed just a little too loud, just a little too close, so it feels like it's inside Catherine's head, and you can almost sense her training kicking in, because she's not reacting like a normal person would react, she's reacting like someone who has learned that reactions can get you killed. She doesn't flinch when she's insulted because she's endured worse than insults, but the camera shows you what does hit her, the way Grace doesn't immediately step beside her, the way Grace doesn't claim her with pride, the way Grace, for a second, lets the room decide what Catherine is. That's why, when the betrayal happens and Grace is the one being torn apart, Catherine's response doesn't feel like, now I get to show off, it feels like, I have to stop this, because Catherine's whole identity is built on the idea that she can handle the ugly parts of the world so Grace doesn't have to, and watching Grace get humiliated in a civilized room is almost worse than watching her in physical danger, because it means the world Grace chose is just another battlefield, only the weapons are smiles and reputations and money, and Catherine understands battlefields better than anyone. One of the smartest bits of writing is how the movie frames Catherine's undercover life as both impressive and tragic without over-explaining it. You don't get a long montage of her becoming a warlord queen with a crown and a cape, you get hints that she has been in places where names are currency and loyalty is the only law, and that she has done things she can't tell Grace because the telling would contaminate Grace's life with danger. That secrecy creates the central emotional irony. Catherine has been protecting Grace by not letting Grace know the full truth, but that same secrecy is part of what allowed Grace to believe Catherine was just drifting, just doing odd jobs, just not trying hard enough, and the engagement party becomes the moment where secrecy backfires, because if Grace had known who Catherine was, maybe she would have defended her instantly, maybe she would have walked into that room with a different spine. But then again, maybe she would have built her whole relationship on that power. Maybe the fiancé would have targeted her differently, maybe the in-laws would have tried to control Catherine through Grace, and the movie subtly suggests there's no perfect choice here, only trade-offs, and that's what makes it feel less like a cheap fantasy and more like a messy adult story wearing a fantasy's clothing. And then, after the reveal, after the room turns, after the social gravity shifts, what really separates this movie from a simple clapback compilation is that it doesn't let the humiliation evaporate like it never happened. It shows you that even when people apologize, their apology isn't always remorse, it's fear. It shows you that when the wealthy in-laws suddenly respect Catherine, that respect is transactional, and Catherine knows it, and you can see it in her eyes, because she's not moved by it. She's seen warlords and kings and men with medals, she's not going to be seduced by a woman who laughed at her 5 minutes ago offering her a seat. That's another theme the movie plays with beautifully, the difference between dignity and validation. Catherine doesn't need their validation, but Grace, painfully, kind of does, because Grace has built her whole adult life around being validated by people who used to look down on her, and the film treats that not as stupidity but as hunger, the hunger you develop when your parents abandon you and you spend your childhood feeling like you weren't worth staying for. Validation becomes your substitute for love. So when the fiancé uses public humiliation as a weapon, he's not just ending an engagement, he's triggering that childhood wound, is reenacting abandonment in front of an audience, and the movie understands that betrayal is never just about the person who betrays you, it's about what the betrayal reminds you of. This is why the fiancé's character lands for a lot of viewers as more chilling than the loud bullies. Loud bullies are obvious. But the fiancé is the kind of person who studies you, finds the softest place in your history, and presses there with a smile, and the film gives him dialogue that feels like it was written by someone who has actually seen this kind of manipulative charm up close, where every sentence is coated in reasonable concern, while being designed to make you look unstable if you react. The way he sets Grace up, The way he frames her story as opportunism, the way he invites the room to judge her while pretending he's just being honest, it's nauseating because it's familiar, and the movie is clearly saying that social execution is still execution, it just leaves the body standing. Now, a lot of people watching this film are going to come for the Warlord Queen part, so let's talk about what that identity actually functions as in the narrative, because it's more than a label. The Warlord Queen is Catherine's armor, yes, but it's also her grief turned outward. It's what happens when a child who was abandoned decides that helplessness will never touch her again. The film implies that Catherine didn't become powerful because she wanted to dominate, she became powerful because she never wanted to beg anyone to stay ever again. And you can feel that in the way she moves after the reveal. She doesn't seek applause. She seeks control. And control, in Catherine's world, means safety. She positions people. She reads threats. She changes the terms. That's why the revenge feels like a strategic operation rather than a tantrum. She doesn't just punish the fiancé, she dismantles his ability to do this to anyone else. She doesn't just scare the in-laws, she exposes their vulnerabilities, the things they've been hiding behind their wealth, because people like that always have something they are hiding, and the movie plays with the idea that the higher you climb socially, the more fragile your image becomes, because it has more to lose. Catherine's power is like a wind that blows through a mansion and reminds everyone it's made of glass. But here's where I think some viewers misread the film if they only watch it for the mic drop. Catherine's real victory isn't that she makes the room regret underestimating her. Her real victory is that she makes Grace realize she doesn't have to earn her right to be treated like a person. That's the deeper catharsis, and it's why the film spends time on Grace's internal shift. After the party collapses, Grace has to sit with the fact that she was willing to sacrifice Catherine's dignity to keep her engagement intact, and she has to face the uglier truth: the engagement was never intact, it was always a conditional contract, and she was always going to lose herself trying to satisfy it. The film's best emotional scenes aren't the public confrontations, they're the quiet aftermath scenes where Grace is alone and the silence is loud, where she replays her own laughter at jokes she hated and realizes she participated in her own erasure, and where Catherine, for all her strength, doesn't know how to comfort her because Catherine's language is action, not tenderness, and tenderness is the one skill abandoned kids rarely get taught. Those scenes are where the performances really show up, because it's easy to act powerful, it's harder to act ashamed without making it melodramatic. Grace's actor sells that shame as something physical, like it sits in her throat, and Catherine's actor sells the frustration of wanting to fix something that can't be fixed with a threat. And I want to talk about the film's visuals again because there's a recurring motif that I think is intentional: reflections. Mirrors at the party, glass doors, glossy surfaces, phone screens catching faces at bad angles. The movie uses reflections to show how the sisters are constantly seeing themselves through other people's eyes. Grace checks herself in a mirror before greeting guests, adjusting not just her hair but her entire identity. Catherine is reflected in glass as she moves through the party's edges, like a ghost in someone else's world. After the reveal, those reflections become sharper, almost confrontational, like the world can't avoid seeing Catherine now, but Catherine still doesn't look at herself much, because her identity has never been about self-image, it's been about mission. Meanwhile Grace, after everything, has to learn to look at herself directly without the mirror of status. That's why the ending hits, because it implies that the sisters' future is not just about Catherine being powerful enough to protect Grace, it's about Grace being strong enough to protect herself emotionally, to choose relationships that don't require her to apologize for her past or edit her family out of her life. In terms of dialogue and writing, there's a particular kind of line the film uses that I think will stick with audiences, lines that sound simple but land heavy because they come after humiliation. When Catherine finally addresses the room, her words aren't flowery. They are blunt. And what makes them cinematic is that she's not arguing, she's declaring terms. It's the difference between begging for fairness and demanding accountability. And the film also gives Grace a line later that feels like the true emotional punch, something about how she thought love meant being chosen, when really love is being seen. That's the core. Grace wanted to be chosen by the fiancé's world because being chosen feels like the antidote to being abandoned. But Catherine, despite all her secrecy, has always seen Grace. And the movie is saying that being seen is more sustaining than being chosen by people who don't even like the parts of you that are real. Now let's get into pacing and structure a bit more, because if you're watching this as a long-form review, you're probably asking, does the film hold up beyond the party sequence, or is it all build up to one viral moment? And honestly, it holds up better than most films in this subgenre because it treats the reveal as a midpoint shift rather than an ending. The party is the inciting earthquake, not the final explosion. Afterward, the movie explores fallout, social fallout, emotional fallout, and consequences that ripple outward. It doesn't just wrap up with everyone bowing to Catherine. It shows the complications of Catherine's identity becoming public, because once you reveal you're the Warlord Queen, you can't reveal it. You can't go back to being invisible. And invisibility was part of Catherine's safety. The film plays with that tension. Catherine's love for Grace pushes her to step into the light, but stepping into the light invites enemies, invites scrutiny, invites a different kind of vulnerability. That's a strong narrative choice because it keeps the story from being purely one-directional wish fulfillment. Power solves some problems and creates others. And the film is also careful not to make Catherine's power feel like it instantly heals Grace. Grace still has to process grief. She still has to face the embarrassment. She still has to navigate the social aftermath. And most importantly, she has to reckon with her own complicity. The movie doesn't punish her for it in a cruel way, but it doesn't pretend it didn't happen. It lets the sisters fight. Not a big soap opera fight, but a real one, where love and resentment share a room. Catherine accuses Grace of forgetting where she came from. Grace accuses Catherine of leaving her alone to build a life without support. Both accusations are true in their own way. And when they finally reach understanding, it isn't because one of them delivers a perfect monologue, it's because they stop trying to win and start trying to understand what survival did to them. That's what makes it emotionally immersive. It's not just, look how cool Catherine is, it's, look what it cost both of them to get here. Audience-wise, the reaction to the film has been intense because it taps into a fantasy that's deeply human, the fantasy that someone will finally walk into the room and make the people who hurt you face consequences. But the film complicates that fantasy by showing that even if someone does that for you, you still have to live with the memory of how quickly the room turned on you. You still have to live with the knowledge that the kindness you were receiving was conditional. That's why the film has rewatchable pain. It's catharsis with a bruise under it. And culturally, it lands in a moment where a lot of people are exhausted by performative politeness, exhausted by institutions that protect the powerful, exhausted by social games that punish authenticity. Catherine is the antidote fantasy, she's authenticity backed by power. But the film also quietly warns you, don't build a world where the only way to be treated fairly is to be feared, because then the powerless never get justice. Catherine is exceptional, most people aren't Warlord Queens. So what are we supposed to do for everyone else? The movie doesn't answer that directly, but it pushes you to ask it, and that's more than a lot of these films do. There's also something to say about how the movie frames femininity. Grace performs a socially approved femininity at the party, soft voice, agreeable laughter, delicate dress, careful manners. Catherine, in the janitor outfit, is stripped of that performance, she's utilitarian, sweaty, practical. When the reveal happens, Catherine doesn't suddenly become hyper-feminine to prove she's worthy, she becomes authoritative on her own terms. And that's refreshing. The Warlord Queen isn't powerful because she adopts masculine swagger, she's powerful because she owns the space with calm certainty. That portrayal matters, because it suggests a kind of female power that isn't dependent on being one of the guys, or being perfectly elegant. It's just power, period, and it's rooted in loyalty. And loyalty is the film's spine. The parents abandoned the sisters. The fiancé betrays Grace. The in-laws' kindness is fake. The classmates are opportunists. In that landscape, the only real loyalty is between Catherine and Grace, even when they disappoint each other, even when they hurt each other, and the movie argues that loyalty like that is a kingdom. That's why the title works as an emotional phrase, not just a plot gimmick. When you say, my sister is the Warlord Queen, you're not just saying, my sister is strong. You're saying, my sister fought battle so I could stand here. You're saying, I underestimated what she carried. You're saying I'm done being ashamed of where we came from. And the film's final tone, for me, is less about triumph over enemies and more about reconciliation with self. Grace has to accept that she can't buy safety by marrying into it. Catherine has to accept that she can't protect Grace by controlling everything and staying hidden. They meet in the middle, honesty, boundaries, and the kind of love that doesn't require either of them to pretend. So if you're asking for the next part of the experience beyond the initial thrill, that's it. The film is ultimately about what happens after the mic drop, after the room goes quiet, after the power reveal, when you're left with the quiet work of rebuilding identity. And that's why, even if some plot mechanics feel heightened or convenient, the emotional mechanics feel earned, because shame, abandonment, and loyalty are universal languages, and the movie speaks them fluently. If you watch My Sister is the Warlord Queen and all you remember is Catherine's authority in that party, you'll still have a good time, but if you let yourself pay attention to Grace's trembling hands, to Catherine's restraint, to the way the film frames a sister stepping between another sister and the world, you'll realize the real spectacle isn't the revenge, it's the love that survives being tested in public, the love that says, even after everything, even after you hesitated,